All right, thanks for tuning in once again as we talk NFL draft, post NFL draft, and we're going to do that for the first time this draft season, talking Denver Broncos football. And we're going to do that for the first time with our special guest, Cody Rourke. He's the host of the Locked On Broncos podcast and also Broncos insider for the Locked On NFL Network. Cody, good to talk to you for the first time.
Absolutely. Thank you for having me on here. Looking forward to talking about the Broncos draft and how things may play out for them.
All right. Well, tell me a little bit about your background. First of all, your connection with the Broncos and how you also got connected with Locked On.
Yeah, so I'm a Broncos insider for the Locked On NFL Network. I've been covering the team for about 4 years through media, and really just the crazy thing about how I got into media was I was playing football, actually, and I tore my ACL in 2015, and I was sidelined. So, for me, I needed something to get me through, so I took up the hobby of being on the radio, and that led to a lot more opportunities. So I was approached to see if I wanted to cover the Denver Broncos specifically for the network, for the Locked On Network. And so, of course, I said absolutely, would love to. And so I've been doing it for about 4 years now, and it's been amazing to see the rise, the ups and the downs of this team, and kind of seeing how they've kind of transformed over the years, especially after you lose Peyton Manning, surefire first ballot Hall of Fame quarterback, and so it's just led to a lot of opportunities, and here we are today.
Were you there Were you there the Super Bowl year?
No, I was not actually.
Was that the year after?
Yeah, the year after. So the 2016 season when Trevor Siemian took over as a starter.
Okay, so you missed the Super Bowl. All right. Well, maybe that's okay because that'll strive you to hope for the first Super Bowl covering the team. Because you don't want to be getting the Super Bowl covering them the very first year. I think you would have been spoiled.
Oh yeah, no, I was kind of covering them independently, which is how I think that's how I was noticed by the network.
Okay.
So I was covering them independently on my own type of podcast that I put together that year. So I was able to get the 2015 season in recollection, but yeah, it wasn't for the network yet.
Denver fan?
I was born in Colorado, so for me, just I'm a football fan. So for me, it's just the game of football. So no real fandom anywhere. So I mean, that's kind of how we got brought to where I'm at now. So it gives me the ability to cover the team objectively and to give fans a lot of perspective about the game, what happens. And so anytime there's a loss, it's okay, what went wrong, but also what went good in that. What can you take away from it? And so I don't think that a lot of people get that in other avenues, especially like local sports media. It's always the narrative of what went wrong, but nobody ever wants to look into the whole X's and O's behind it. And so that's something that I kind of do.
Okay. Well, we look forward to hear about how you are going to break down these 10 picks. So we have 10 picks. All 10 picks, by the way, were in the draft guide. 2 rookie free agent signings in the draft guide. So that's a good thing to know that all these players were in the draft guide. So no crazy picks from who knows where. But I will say this, and I'm sure you've encountered this, of course, covering the team and the draft for the past month, but you might have the toughest pronunciations of any team in the draft, because not only do you have 10 players, but let's see, you have Uje Muda. Is that how you say it? Uje Muda?
OJ Mudia.
OJ Mudia. Okay. OJ Mudia. You have, let's see, you have McTelvin Ujim. Is that right?
Ajim. Yeah, Ajim.
Ajim. We have to put like a G and I don't know, like a Z-E-E-M or something like that. We've got Albert Okuabunam. Okay, right. I was not even close. Okay. We've got Justin Sternad.
Yep, Sternin. Yep.
Okay, Sternid. We've got Natani Muti.
Correct. Yep.
All right. And we have Derrick Tusker.
Yep. Perfect.
All right. That's enough, man. I mean, come on. What are they doing to you? And you had to really know how to pronounce these guys' names, because that's a very important part of it. They're all new, and I'm sure the fans are probably even a lot worse than I am. But the fact is, there were a lot of picks. This has been the one part of the Denver Broncos that really, the draft has been the one part of their growth over the years that has kind of held them back. Elway has done a very good job implementing veterans to the team, whether it's a quarterback or what have you. but the draft has kind of held them back. I think the last year's draft and this year's draft, well, this year's draft we'll see, but I like the amount of players they have, and I love Judy, their top pick. But I think maybe these last 2 years could be the start of something special.
Yeah, and I might even throw in the last 3 years. When you look at the 2018 draft class that they got there, I mean, obviously Cortland Sutton is now the number one wide receiver for that
True,
team.
true.
Bradley Chubb, he's coming back off of an ACL surgery, and he was playing at a high level and through 4 games before he tore that. So 2018, 2019, they've really panned out for the Broncos so far. And then now 2020 on paper looks like a phenomenal draft, but the ultimate test is going to be how do they perform on field. So I'm excited to see if the 2020 draft class evolves into being yet another, I'd say, a win in free agency in the NFL draft period for John Elway. And it's going to be a tough season for them ahead, obviously, with the whole COVID-19 pandemic, not being able to have mini camp as expected and OTAs and, a potential delay in training camp possibly. Who knows what the reality is supposed to be? But Drew Lock was supposed to be throwing with the receivers in April. Obviously, he was not able to do that due to restrictions that we got statewide and all across the United States. So I think it's going to be an interesting year. It's going to be a challenging year, but I think it could be a rewarding year for the Broncos as well.
All right, let's start with the first pick, and we might as well start with the position as well, because Judy was one of 3 receivers the team added. KJ Hamler went with the second pick. They also added Tyree Cleveland with one of their 7th round draft picks. One of the things I did notice on a negative side with all 3 of the players, they need to be a little bit more consistent as far as their hands are concerned. That includes Judy. That might be the one and only knock on Jerry Judy. But the fact that the Broncos were able to get Jerry Judy with the 15th pick, I mean, I don't even that's such a steal. I mean, I love Jerry Judy. I think he is the first receiver to remind me of maybe what it looked like when Jerry Rice came into the league. Not saying Judy's going to be Rice, but the precise route running, the ability after the catch, those are just things that Judy has, and he's so good at it. And that's a trait that is usually the toughest for young receivers to grasp. And Judy is already an expert at it.
Yeah, well, you've got NFL wide receivers. They were asking Jerry Judy. I mean, I think it was 1 year, 2 years ago while he was still in college. They were asking him in his direct messages on Twitter about, hey, can you work with me on my route releases? How do you release and how do you, things like that. So I think that for a guy who's young, he's got a lot of these guys in the NFL that kind of look up to some of the things that he does and the way that Jerry Judy carries himself. I mean, he's a humble human being. He's quiet to himself. It was to a point where Nick Saban at one point approached Jerry Judy. I think it was early on in his career at Alabama. And he says, hey, how come you don't talk much? Is everything okay? And he says, I'm just working, coach. And so for him, he's got that mentality. He's got a chip on his shoulder. And for him to be available at 15, I think was an absolute steal for the Broncos because on my draft board, I thought that Jerry Judy was going to be the first wide receiver taken. I thought the Raiders were going to go with a guy like Jerry Judy. They go with Ruggs instead. And Henry Ruggs was widely mocked to the Denver Broncos. I mean, we even thought at one point, too, Henry Ruggs was going to be one of the top prospects for the Broncos due to his speed alone. And that was one of the needs in the offseason was a burner at the wide receiver position to help counteract what Kansas City has with Tyreek Hill. So the Broncos, they go a different direction there. Jerry Judy runs 4.4 speed, but as you mentioned, his route running is incredible. His ability to create separation, and one thing he does really well is he knows how to manipulate defensive backs. When he's running his route, right at the top of his route, he can give a head fake or a shoulder move, and all of a sudden that DB is going to commit to wherever he gives that look to. He turns his hips and shoulders, they lock, and then he goes the other way. So it forces them to reverse pivot and try to turn. And so that's where the separation is created there. He does a great job of that. He was probably the best route runner in the 2020 NFL draft. And I think that his dynamic, when you add him to the mix for the Broncos and a Pat Shurmur offense where they go 3 wide receiver sets, I think, it could be a great compliment to what Cortland Sutton's able to do as a sizable, explosive wide receiver as well.
Yeah, elite body control. You got the speed to match. And the fact that you already mentioned Cortland Sutton, that's Drew Lock has got to be loving it right now, just drooling over the possibilities of having those receivers in only a second year. Some quarterbacks go 10, 11 years and they don't have receiving talent that rich that Drew Lock is going to have to work with when the season begins. Now we go to Hamler, and it's interesting because I did a mock draft, our mock draft with our lads, and we had about 4 other. I think there were 4 others, myself and Dan Shanka, who runs the site, and we did this mock draft, a 7-round mock draft, and I had Denver, and I think I took 2 receivers in the first 3 picks, and Dan messaged me. I think this was at our first break. He messaged me and he said, you picked two receivers for Denver. Did you want to do that? Because that's kind of unusual. And again, I might have done it successfully the first two picks, but it was either the first two or two of the top three. And I said, no, Denver needs two receivers. And sure enough, they went with two receivers in their top two picks. And this was a spot after Sutton that you just, when you looked at their depth chart, you understood that there was such a need for them to not only to add talent to the roster, but also there were a couple of the players that are already there that need to be pushed. More competition. Hamler definitely gives them that competition. He's a little bit undersized. He's electric with the ball in his hands. He can play the slot. He can play outside. How do you think he's going to fit into this Denver offense?
I think that they're going to put him in the slot primarily. He's going to be the guy I think that they run some jet motion with and obviously some bow motion behind the tailback, that kind of utility player. His speed alone, his legitimate 4.2 speed, I mean, he's fast. If you watched him on tape, he gets open based on his speed, right?
Yes.
And he reminds me so much, honestly, of Emmanuel Sanders. The way Emmanuel Sanders runs routes in the NFL, when I watch him, because I've watched Denver over the years with Emmanuel Sanders, and I watched him obviously in San Francisco last year, KJ Hamler reminds me so much of him with how crisp he is in his route running as well, and just the speed dynamic there. So, for example, let's say that you come out in a trips formation, and then you're going to have Cortland Sutton left side one-on-one. Well, let's say that you have Tim Patrick on the outside, Jerry Judy in the slot as the number 2 receiver, and let's say you put KJ Hamler as the number 3 receiver inside there. Well, as a defense, you can't disguise your coverage because, for example, you're going to have a one-on-one situation with Cortland Sutton. If you do that, then, he's going to have an opportunity to make one of those plays on a 50-50 ball. Well, then if you cheat over your safety a little bit too far and KJ Hamler runs all the way up the seam vertically and his speed is there, and if you're off by just a half yard, he could get behind you because he's got that Tyreek Hill true burner type speed to him. I think that it's going to create more opportunities for the Broncos offense to have success. They only scored 17 points per game in 2019. They got to put up more if they're going to expect to win. And if they want to compete in the AFC West with Kansas City, who puts up, they could put up 40 points and a half really easily. And we've seen them put up points, just lightning strike. Go back to that divisional game that they had. Obviously in the AFC divisional game against the Houston Texans. Houston was up multiple scores there. Bam, all of a sudden, Houston's down within, a whole entire quarter. So it just goes to show that you got to be able to find a way to put up points. And I think for the Broncos, since Peyton Manning retired, they have struggled offensively to be able to put up points on the board. And really, they've been carried by their defense. And they got a strong defense this year. But I think the additions offensively, if the Broncos don't score more than 20 points per game in 2020, I'm going to be very shocked.
Yeah, that's a lock problem if they don't score more than 20 points a game because the talent is there. Will Hamler also add in the kick return game?
Not right now. That's not the expectation. They want to go with Deontay Spencer in the return game. He was a Pro Bowl alternate in 2019, but primarily I think Deontay Spencer is going to make the team as the team's primary returner.
Okay.
And for a guy like KJ Hamler, with the speed that he has and the value he can provide to your offense, I don't think they want to put him in a position where he could potentially get hurt on special teams, right? If you factor in kick return, sometimes that's where you're going to get hit the hardest because you got guys running downfield full steam. And I don't think they want to put him in that position. Now, he's more than capable of returning, as we saw with him in Penn State. We saw that touchdown return against Michigan where he ran the length of the entire field in 10.9 seconds overall. That is ridiculous speed right there. So I think that they're going to transition him just to offense primarily. They're going to keep Deontay Spencer as a return guy. But if he is going to return balls at any point, I think punt return would probably be more a likely scenario for him. We see the Kansas City Chiefs do that with Tyreek Hill. We don't see them put him on kick return, though.
Sure.
So I think punt return might be the one place where we see KJ Hamler maybe get an opportunity to return. But outside of that, I think primarily a receiver.
All right. And then Cleveland was a receiver they drafted in the 7th round. He's interesting because he has the triangle numbers you're looking for a receiver at the NFL: 6'2", 209, 4.4 speed. Mainly, you look at him as a kind of a deep threat option. That's possibly what he'll be able to bring to the team. But he's also, you're looking at a kid that can be very good on special teams. I believe he was a gunner. Punt coverage, did a really good job there for the University of Florida. And anytime you drafted in the 7th round, you had better add to special teams.
Yeah, special teams is super important. And I think that really for a guy like Tyreek Cleveland, I like you mentioned, I think I could see him making the team first and foremost based on special teams alone. Being a gunner, being a guy on kickoff, being a guy that's going to fly down there and make tackles. And I think it's going to create more opportunities for him. And you never know. At some point, your number may be called a wide receiver. I mean, they have a widely deep room right now. And so I don't know necessarily if Cleveland will play himself into a rotation in the 2020 season. Certainly possible. I mean, we got to get through training camp and we got to be able to see where these guys look and how they fit in preseason. But that's one thing I really like about what the Broncos coaching staff does is they put a lot of these rookies in with the starters in training camp and mini camp just to see if they're able to play with those guys. And that's how Vic Fangio and company, they evaluate their talent, which I think is great because you're getting those guys confidence if they're performing well against the starters. And you also can maybe set some guys back down to reality a little bit that maybe they're just not quite ready to play with the starters just yet. So I think it's a great evaluation tool. But for Tyreek Cleveland, I could see him playing a big role on special teams this year.
And as I was saying before we got started, I think if anything, when you add these three receivers, especially Judy and Hamler, to the mix, it's going to push a Patrick or a Hamilton, and they've got to step up because there's been some inconsistencies, especially with Hamilton. So, can you see that being a really good as far as the competition at camp? We know where Sutton is, and we kind of have a pretty good idea where Judy is, but everybody else, there should be a really good competition between the veterans and the rookies.
Well, yeah, and I think it's going to be interesting that Deshaun Hamilton and KJ Hamler, they were teammates at Penn State.
Yeah, that's
And
right.
so
Yeah.
they have familiarity with each other. And we saw Deshaun Hamilton come into his own a little bit with Drew Lock as the quarterback in the last two games of the regular season. He finished
Okay.
with 12 catches. And that week 17 game against Oakland, he had 6 catches, and every catch, every 6 catches, moved the chains for a first down. So
Nice.
he found a lot of comfort there. He was a security blanket for Drew Lock, and so he's got confidence there. So, even if Deshaun Hamilton, let's say, is the number 3 receiver or the number 4 receiver, I think that the Broncos in the 3 wide receiver set, whether it be Sutton, Judy, Hamler, I still think they're going to rotate guys like Tim Patrick, Deshaun Hamilton
Sure.
in. And also, it depends on if some of these other guys come out of nowhere, maybe outperform them, then maybe they can work their way up, and then maybe those guys take a step back. But I think that's a good problem to have for the Broncos. And they
Yeah.
got a relatively young wide receiver room. Cortland Sutton, Tim Patrick, Deshaun Hampton are the oldest guys in that
Yeah, that's
locker room.
right.
They're the
Yeah.
vets there. I think that they're in good hands, especially with wide receiver coach Zach Azzani. I mean, he does a phenomenal job with them, and he was Antonio Brown's position coach at Central Michigan. So I think that what we've seen from the Broncos and their growth, I mean, Azzani has been part of 2 different staffs now in Denver. So that means that the current organization now sees him very highly
Yes.
based on his ability. And so working with guys like DT and Emmanuel Sanders, he did a lot for those guys, and those guys did a lot for Cortland Sutton, Deshaun Hampton, Tim Patrick, and now it's their turn to kind of teach these young guys how it's done. So training camp is going to be really fun. They got a lot of wide receivers in that room right now.
Okay, now since we're talking receivers, we might as well talk about Locke's former teammate, the tight end out of Missouri. 23 touchdowns in 33 games. He has, if you take a look at it, his body, his ball skills, the combination, he's a scary tight end to cover, especially at the college level. Now, there are a lot of inconsistencies in his game. There ain't no question about that. Blocking, I mean, you can kind of say the blocking is always going to be one of the main issues of any college tight end, but even more so for this kid. So there's a lot of work that he needs to undertake if he wants to be a full-time tight end. But boy, does he have talent, and the fact that he's going to go to a team where his former quarterback was, they had a great history together for their time together, their short time together, but still, I think that's going to be a huge bonus.
They're great friends in real life. Drew Lock really attests a lot that Albert O is a great person on and off the football field. So no question about it. I mean, the Broncos, Vic Fangio, John Elway called Drew Lock the morning of the draft when the Broncos were getting ready to be on the clock in round number 4. And they asked Drew, hey, what type of player is he? What type of person is he? So they really relied on the feedback from Drew Lock. And so I think that was a big thing in the organization's trust in Drew. But, I think early on for Albert O, we mentioned there's been so much change over the years at Mizzou in terms of the offensive scheme, the coordinators, and obviously the quarterbacks. That's been a big change since Drew Lock left. And obviously, it's a different kind of feel when you have a new quarterback that you have to try to develop some chemistry with. And so what we saw with Albert O in 2019, it wasn't the best of the tape that I think that we could possibly have seen from him. I think a lot of that is due to the change. You lose your
Sure.
quarterback where you had a lot of productivity, but Albert O, he leaned up a little bit. He got a little bit more muscle toned, and he also got faster because his freshman year, there was a specific game against Arkansas where they just used him and he blocked his tail off. And he was a very good blocker. He was bigger there, and you could quite see that, he was a freshman at that time. And so they utilized him. He's very capable of blocking, but I think that a lot of that has to do with maybe putting on some weight. And he had some weight in his freshman season. So I think if he puts on a little bit more weight in the
Okay.
NFL, I primarily see him being used as one of those wing options, though, where, you're going to bring him backside underneath the formation. You're going to fake the inside handoff to the running back, and you're going to dump it out to the flat to him. He's going to catch in the flat and take it upfield. And I think he's going to be a red zone threat for the Broncos, particularly maybe in a double tight set with Noah Fant there. So, you have the size, you have the speed there between both tight ends for Denver. It's just one of those pick your poison type options there. And I think Nick Vannett for the Broncos is going to be a blocking tight end, but Albert Okwuegbunam is definitely one of those guys that I'm very intrigued to see how he transitions into the National Football League. And he's got a great experienced tight end coach in Wade Harmon. I think he's going to work with him and get him in the right place.
All right. Let's stay on offense. Talk about the offensive lineman that they drafted in the third round, Cushing Berry, the kid from LSU, who, if you read the reports, not only was he the leader of the offensive line, but he was primarily one of the top leaders of the entire team. So that's always good. Smart anchor, a powerful kid. You like that, no question. There's some facets of his game, like in pass protection, that he's going to have to work on to be more of a complete center. And there were a lot of people that thought that Cushing Berry was going to go first as far as the centers were concerned. There was a late push for that, but our lads always had Cesar Ruiz as the number one center, and then Hennessy. I think Cushing Berry might have been fourth, maybe. But again, shore up the pass protection. You might have yourself a complete center. Either way, this is a kid that could end up being on the field week one, year one, and really help out, considering that Denver, of course, is looking to replace some talent within the interior of their offensive line.
Yeah, well, they were eyeing Matt Hennessy, and obviously the Atlanta Falcons took him. So they were eyeing him, and Cushing Berry was one of the next guys on their board. And so for Cushing Berry, I think some of the struggles he had in 2019 is because, look, the offense changed a little bit. They went more spread them out, and so he did allow, more interior pass rush penetration, I think, that he had in any other years of his career at LSU. But he's a guy that's smart, he's tenacious, and he's also willing to learn. And I think for him, having a position coach in Mike Munchak, that's going to be fun to watch because Munchak has transformed offensive lines wherever he's been in his career. We've seen it a little bit with the Broncos in 2019. So I think that, he's going to go into training camp right now in competition with Patrick Morris and Austin Schlottman for the center position, but he's the odds-on favorite early on to be able to be that center there. And then you got Graham Glasgow. They brought in for free agency on a 4-year, $44 million deal. They signed him there at the right guard position. Juwan James coming back healthy for 2020. And then at left guard, you have Dalton Reisner, who, didn't even play like a rookie in 2019. He was one of the most impressive offensive linemen they had. And then Garrett Bowles in the final year of his contract. They declined the 5th year on there. He has a chance to, if he has the best year of his career, maybe get an extension, but there's a chance that the Broncos maybe look at left tackle at some other point in time, but he's going to have competition with Elijah Wilkinson, a left tackle in training camp.
Yeah, because I was going to ask you about that with Glasgow, but it now with Cushing Berry on board, it definitely makes more sense that Glasgow will play guard instead of center. As a Jet fan, I want to kind of steal about 30 seconds of your time to ask you about Mcgovern.
Yes. Connor Mcgovern, he's a tough football player. He is probably he's very strong, and that's one thing I've always liked about him. But for him, he's also willing to do a lot of work that nobody else is willing to do. And so back in, I believe it was 2018, Matt Paradis, he broke his leg in a game.
Mm-hmm.
And so Connor Mcgovern was playing top-tier football as a right guard. I mean, he was one of the highest-rated right guards in the NFL at that time. He had to make the transition over to center. So he had to learn center on the fly. And, at first he struggled a little bit, but then he started to pick it up a little bit. And he played pretty consistently for the Broncos in 2019. I think the Jets are getting a good player in Mcgovern, who's now more comfortable at center than I think he's ever been. So that bodes really well to where maybe what the Jets going to get, obviously, in the Broncos and Jets going to face off in about week 4 on Thursday Night Football of the 2020 NFL regular season. So he's going to be a tough, tenacious football player. He's constantly looking to get better, and I think that he's going to bring some nastiness to that offensive line in New York.
Was it a cash situation? Douglas has kind of let it be known that he was surprised that he was available.
It was mainly on the assumption that the Broncos didn't want to pay Connor McGovern $10 million per year to be a center,
Got it.
right? That was the initial thought in the discussion early on. And so when they signed Graham Glasgow, they came into that with the assumption in mind that, okay, well, with Graham Glasgow, he could potentially play center. And so
Sure.
we signed this guy to a 4-year, $44 million deal. If he's going to play center, he's going to play center. And then they could have Elijah Wilkinson at right guard. And then, you go into the NFL draft and you obviously address some of the interior
And now you got
offensive
Cushing
line back
Berry.
there.
Yeah.
And so I think that it really kind of played out well for them. But I
Yeah.
think the Broncos, they didn't want to possibly get burned on paying a guy that only had a year and a half experience at center
Sure.
$10 million per year. So I think that was really the thought process behind it.
Yeah, it seems like a win-win for both teams, actually, with
Yeah.
Cushionberry on board now for Denver. Okay, let's add in Muti from Fresno State, a sixth rounder. Basically, you're looking at a gamble, a late round gamble, a player who's been through 2 Achilles injuries and a Lisfranc injury. There's really not a whole, even though he played for several years, I think he only made 19 starts in 3 years because of all the injuries. So this is a player that more than likely you would think you stash him on practice squad and you see what you got.
I think he's going to be a depth player. I don't know if he'd be able to sit on the practice squad long, and here's why: because a lot of NFL teams, I mean, he had I think between a round 3 and a round 1 grade if healthy. Like if he didn't have any of those injuries, as you mentioned, many NFL organizations believe that Netane Muti was going to be a first round talent, and the Broncos had a third round grade on him, and they were able to get him in round number 6, which is
Wow.
tremendous
Okay.
value. I think it's a project for sure, right? In my opinion, I think it's a low risk, high reward possibility because you do
Oh,
have
yeah.
depth already on the offensive line. And if Muti, for some reason, if Dalton Reisner or the right guard, if Glasgow, or if the center position, if let's say Cushingberry's starting, if Cushingberry gets hurt, you could bump Glasgow over to center and you could put Elijah Wilkinson at right guard, or Netane Muti at right guard. Or if Dalton Reisner gets hurt, I think Netane Muti could play there. Ideally, the Broncos plan for Netane Muti, redshirt him, develop him under Mike Munchak, and if he can stay healthy, he might be one of those guys they can roll with down the road. And, I don't think the expectation is going to come in and be a starter or compete, but you just never know. I mean, injuries happen at any point in time. It's the next man up. But the thing about Netane Muti that I really like is you can see it on his game tape. He's physical. He's fast. And he's also, for a big offensive lineman, he's very versatile. And he likes to block anybody that's wearing a different colored jersey. The one thing I would say that he needs to work on as a player is just kind of playing in control, because he plays with such a high motor. Sometimes he's getting up to the next level. He's going to chip down on the one technique, get up to the play side inside backer, try to seal him off, and he's not going to set his feet. And so he's going to lunge and get outside his base a little bit. So it could be a holding call. So that's an area he's got to really improve on, is just playing controlled football. But he plays violent football, and violent in a sense where when I watch him on film, he bullies dudes the way that Quentin Nelson used to bully dudes when he was playing at Notre Dame. So that, to me, I don't like to compare the two,
Sure.
but the play style, just how nasty they are, it's fun to watch. And I think the Broncos might have a little bit of a steal in Netane Muti. If he ends up playing, if he performs well, then he could be a potential steal. But I think ultimately it's a low risk, high reward move.
Well, look, if the Broncos had him as a third round grade, then he's making the 52. So yeah, everybody's got it. Only takes one team, and if one team or several teams had him as a third round grade, then they have every intention to keep him and not lose him on the practice squad as long as he's healthy at the camp. Okay, let's talk about, because you mentioned steal. So I have to talk about the player who could end up as one of the biggest deals in the entire draft. So let's talk about their 7th round pick from North Dakota State. Tusker, Derrick Tusker, who was part of 4 FCS championship teams at North Dakota State. And he's played in 14 FCS playoff games, 29 and a half career sacks. He's got the speed, athleticism, hands, football smarts to go along with this relentless passion for the game. I love all of that about a defensive edge rusher. You get a guy that has all those traits, that can get to the quarterback, that's been in big games, that's been one of the top defensive players at the FCS level, and you get him in the 7th round. I'm wondering, what were the rest of the teams in the NFL thinking?
It's really hard to say. With Derrick Tusker, I mean, the one thing that stands out with him on film, he does play with a high motor. Now, my biggest question is he played in a 4-3 defensive scheme at North Dakota State. The Broncos, they run a 3-4 defensive scheme. Right now, I think the biggest question is, are the Broncos planning on maybe working him at some outside backer, or are they
Sure.
planning on working him at defensive end as a 5 technique or even a 3 technique? If they really plan on working him as a defensive end in a 3-4 style of defense, I think he's probably got to put on maybe 15 to 20 more pounds just because, he is fast. But then again, I mean, his speed could be an effective factor, considering if you're trying to pass rush the quarterback. So I think for me, the biggest test at camp is he going to be playing outside back or is he going to be playing some defensive end? But regardless, the thing that does stand out on tape is he loves football. He's a captain. He's got high character. That's one of the criteria that the Broncos and John Elway and their personnel department really wanted in their prospects that they want to bring to Denver. They want to bring in guys that have high character on and off the football field. And they want guys that are going to come in and compete. And I think for Derrick Tusker, he is ultimately very competitive. Just in terms of, and like I said, I'm not comparing him to this player, but the way that he is athletically and how fast he is, he reminds me a lot of one of the Bosa brothers, the Chargers. I think for Joey Bosa,
Okay.
he reminds me a lot of Joey Bosa from the standpoint, not as big as Joey Bosa, but as athletic, I think, as Joey Bosa is. So to me, I think that's the one thing I look at with Derrick Tusker. To be able to get him in round number 7, that's a pretty damn good haul, if you're asking me. And, certainly I think he was probably on several teams' radars. And I think some teams are trying to get him as undrafted. And I think for the Broncos, for 7th-round pick, I think he's a pretty good player. Is he going to play right away in 2020? I'm not sure yet. But like I said, training camp's going to answer all these questions.
And you know what? I think maybe a player that has had that kind of ability to get to the passer, I think he's about 255, maybe even a little bit lighter. I think it makes more sense on a 3-4 team to maybe have him lose a few pounds and
Possibly, yeah.
play that edge role as far as the pass rusher. I know they have Chubb, I know they have Miller, but when you play a 3-4, man, you can't have enough 3-4 outside linebackers that are going to go after the quarterback. That's what everybody can talk about Peyton Manning all they want, but we know there was Denver's defense. It was Von
Mhm.
Miller. That was the main reason they won the Super Bowl. And with Chubb coming back from injury, this is the time. Look, they lost Shaq Barrett. We'll talk more about Barrett when we talk again at training camp, because that's a player I want to target on and find out more about exactly how he got away. But this is a player we're going to monitor for sure, because he's got. What I want to know is, and I'm sure you'll find out even more by the time we talk again around training camp, is what was the reason he lasted so long? Because
Yeah.
that's a mystery. So.
Well, and I think too, outside backer, it's just for me, I think it's going to be hard for him to make it an outside backer necessarily because they did bring back Jeremiah Tauchu, veteran pass rusher. He came up big for the Broncos last year. He's going to be the number 3 outside backer between Bradley Chubb and Von Miller. And then they have Malik Reed, who was an undrafted free agent that really came in and played his tail off and solidified himself as one of those potential next undrafted gems. And then behind him, you have Justin Hollins, who is going to play a little bit of that hybrid role at inside backer and dime packages and also outside backer. And we saw that. So I think I just part of me is wondering where the Broncos are really going to be placing Derrick Tusker. So, training camp's going to give us a
Yeah.
lot of those answers.
And
for sure.
maybe he's a situational edge rusher. Maybe
Yeah,
that's
possibly.
that, and maybe he lines up on the edge. It's very possible. But he is also maybe one of those players where Denver looked up and said, "Wait a second, we have our last pick here. This kid doesn't necessarily fit our scheme, but he's too talented. We can't pass him up. Let's try to see if we can fit him into what we can do, because that's what you do. You pick talent and you work that talent into your scheme. This is a player we'll monitor. Bottom line. Let's talk about some more of the defensive players. Let's start with their top third round pick, the corner from Iowa. Good size and length for the position with 4.4 speed. So you like that. He's got good cover experience on special teams. What does Denver like about him the most?
He's a leader. That's one of the biggest things too. And he's a zone style cornerback primarily, which is, what Vic Fangio and the Broncos run. Now, surprisingly in 2019, they actually ran a lot of man coverage. They play some match zone concepts, but a lot of times they did play man coverage on various situations, depending on if it was the field side, the boundary side. But they brought in Michael Ojemudia because he's a smart football player. And one of the things too is he tackles. And for Vic Fangio, he's always been a big proponent. He says, if my cornerbacks, they can't tackle, they're not going to play for me. So the Broncos cornerbacks, they all work on tackling every single day. And OJ Moody on film he's a technician. He's very attention to detail. He's very smart. He processes the field really quickly. And I think for the Broncos, that's why they brought him in. Now, is he going to be a starter starter on the outside in 2020? I'm not quite sure. There's going to be competition there because they brought back Devontae Bosby on a one-year deal in free agency. They have Isaac Yiadom entering year number 3. They have Devontae Harris, who stepped up and started a few games for them on the outside last year. So they have a lot of depth right now in that room. And I think for Michael Ojemudia, it's going to be really intriguing to see how they use him. I think he will play a special teams role, but I do think in various situations, if the Broncos go to a true dime package in passing situations against spread teams like Kansas City, I do think that you're going to see more, more 6 DB sets, and I think that Michael Ojemudia is going to fit in that role a little bit. So I think that primarily 2020 could be a one of those years where he sits and waits, but like I said, he's got a chance to compete for that job at training camp, and it's certainly going to be fun to watch because he's, like I said, he's a fun player to watch in Iowa, and when he was off the field at Iowa, they noticeably struggled without him out there.
All right. Well, let's talk about the second defensive player in the third round they chose. That was Ujim from Arkansas, a 4-year starter, played on the outside his first few years, waited until his senior year before he moved inside a tackle. You're talking about a rare blend of size, length, speed for the position. So he's that type of athlete. Where do you see him fitting, though, with Denver? Is there an immediate need, or is there an immediate spot for this kid?
I think there is. And to me, when the Broncos picked him, I felt like this was probably for Denver out of all their 10 picks. I know it's hard to say this, but I feel like he's probably going to be the one, in my opinion, I feel like he's going to be one of the biggest steals because he can play defensive end. He could play in a 1 technique. He could play in a 3 technique. He could play in a 5 technique. He could do a little bit of both there. He's sizable, and he's also very strong at the point of attack. And so when he gets his hands on offensive linemen, he drives them back. And he also has violent hands to be able to create separation and shuck blocks. And so I think for him, it's going to be hard to see because you have Shelby Harris back on a 1-year deal at defensive end. You have Jarrell Casey you brought in via trade. And then you have Draymond Jones, who emerged for the Broncos last year as one of those big-time players, DeMarcus Walker, Derrick Tusker if he's there. But McTelvin Ajim's got a big role here. And I think his ability to play both defensive end and defensive tackle, that's going to bode well for his opportunities to get on the football field. And I think that's what we're going to see from him.
All right. And also on defense, we'll end as far as our picks first with the linebackers. The 5th rounder, Sternin from Wake Forest, and then, actually, we already talked about Tusker, so let's just wrap up with Sternin, and then we'll get into the 3 players I wanted to ask you about as far as rookie free agents. But the kid from Wake Forest, cover linebacker, really good special teams performer at Wake Forest. Is that what we're looking for? Did they target him as a cover linebacker?
That was the idea, yes. And so for Justin Sternin, I mean, he's a guy that plays with a high motor, very disciplined, very consistent off the edge, especially against the run. And he's also got the versatility and the speed to be able to cover in the passing game. Now, he suffered an injury in 2019, so for the Broncos, they look at what he's been able to do. And Vic Fangio mentioned that he's going to have Justin Sternin come into training camp or rookie mini camp. He's going to learn inside backer first, and that's something that they did with Justin Hollins, who they drafted out of Oregon in round 5 of the 2019 NFL draft. And so he's going to learn that coverage linebacker position a little bit, and then he's going to work a little bit on some outside. So they're just going to try to use him in both pieces. Vic Fangio likes those guys that could do, more than just one thing on defense. He believes it gives them value. And as you mentioned, too, special teams. I mean, he is that type of player. In my opinion, I feel like Justin Sternin could be a special teams captain for the Denver Broncos immediately in 2020. I think that he's the type of player that will get down there and make almost every tackle on kickoff or punt. And I think he's going to be one of those guys you can really rely on. So I wouldn't be surprised early on if a guy like Sternin, it becomes a special teams guy or a special teams captain overall. So to speak. So he's one of those guys that's so versatile that Vic Fangio is going to work his magic with him and use him as a project.
All right. Now, out of the 3 rookie free agents the team signed, let's start first on defense with the song Bassie. And only 5'9", but he's got 4.4 speed. He worked in the slot in the Senior Bowl. So do you think that's where he fits in with Denver? And you like the fact that I'm assuming they like the fact that he played zone at Wake Forest, did a good job there. That's what Fangio wants to do. So what's his chances of making the team?
Yeah, saying Basie's an interesting prospect. As you mentioned, 5'9". A lot of people look at it and be like, oh, he's 5'9", he's too short to play in the NFL. But if he could play in the slot, if he's a surefire tackler, if he's a smart football player, you can use anybody. It doesn't matter about size or speed. It's about being smart. And he's a very, very smart football player, understands coverages really well, understands how his coverage responsibility changes depending on formations and route concepts that may be thrown his way. So he's very good at adjusting. And I think for the Broncos, they viewed him as, one of those players that they wanted to bring in and see what he could do. They have a lot of defensive back depth right now overall on the roster, But when you factor in a guy like Basie and the Broncos' success in recent history with bringing in undrafted players that become like big name players at some point, they certainly want to try that track record out with him. So I think Asang Basie is probably one of those players that I feel like does have a really good chance of making the roster. Like I said, it just really depends on how he plays in training camp. But right now, there's some high expectations for him.
All right, not bad for a rookie free agent. Now, Levante Bellamy, the running back out of Western Michigan, these running backs, especially from the MAC, are always going to get lost in this, whether it's a real late round pick or a free agent, just because of the competition they played at. And if they're not a well-rounded player, you're going to pick on the fact that maybe he's not the best blocker. He's had some injury histories in his career, but you're looking at a player who was the 2019 MAC Offensive Player of the Year for a reason. Over 1,400 yards rushing. 23 rushing touchdowns last year. He's also got the ability, if the Broncos ever want to use him as a kick returner, he's got that ability with 4.4 speed. You're just looking at a kid that produced at the highest level possible at the MAC. And we've seen a lot of quality players, top players that have gone on from the MAC to have successful NFL careers. So I was a little surprised that he wasn't drafted. I think he's got a chance to make the team. Now, whether or not it's practice squad or not, practice squad, that could happen because a lot of times running backs can be stashed in the practice squad because there's a ton of running backs on practice squads all over the NFL. But what do you think about Bellamy?
Yeah, Bellamy is very intriguing in my opinion. I think that he's going to come in training camp, and I think he's going to compete with Royce Freeman, and he's also going to compete with Khalfani Muhammad for the team's third running back spot. And as you mentioned, he could obviously be one of those guys you stash away on the practice squad. But yeah, he definitely intrigues me. He's a hard runner. He's very smart, and he's very decisive. He's quick with his cuts on the inside. If a hole opens up, he takes it. And he's also got that speed to get on the outside edge very quickly and to make guys miss. And so I think for the Broncos, he's also got that dynamic to maybe be a receiver out of the backfield. And so for him, the workload that he carried last year was phenomenal to be able to see that high amount of productivity. I mean, as you mentioned, 23 touchdowns on the ground. That's pretty special overall. So he's going to come in. He's going to compete for a job on the 53-man roster. I think he's going to have a good chance of doing so.
All right, and then the last player I wanted to ask you about is a Division II wide receiver from Tarleton State. So tell me why, because this is the one player that we're going to talk about in this show that was not in the draft guide. So tell us a little bit about this Division II wide receiver.
So Zamari Manning is from Tarleton State, and I tell you what, he's got impressive tape. And sometimes you always try to find these gems in D2 football. Zamari Manning alone in 2019, he had 22 receiving touchdowns, and that was a lot. And
that is a lot.
There was a game where he had over 257 receiving yards, and it wasn't even, I think it was close to halftime. So I think he had a lot of that in the first half. 257 total receiving yards. He had multiple touchdown games, obviously factoring into 22 overall touchdowns, 1,400 yards receiving. He's sizable, and he's really built in a sense where he could be a guy in the slot. He can also be a gunner. But the thing that stands out about Zamari Manning is the fact that, he's a physical football player, and he's very explosive, and he understands how to get behind coverages, safeties, cornerbacks, whatever it may be. He understands body positioning, and he's just one of those guys you can also throw the ball up to. But I think for his route running ability, he's a good blocker as well. So I think that bodes well for his favor. He's one of those guys I don't think a lot of people are really talking about in terms of that, because the Broncos also brought in another Wake Forest wide receiver in Kendall Hinton. I don't necessarily think he's going to have much of a chance in this deep wide receiver room, but Zamari Manning is one of those guys that I do think will be an impact player. Maybe not on offense right away in 2020. I do think he's going to make the team and maybe be a special teams guy, or like you said, he could be a practice squad stash away for 1 year, but his tape is really, really impressive for Tarleton State.
Yeah, when you play at the Division II level, what you want to see is complete domination. And it sure sounds like he dominated at that level. Next step is to find out whether or not he has what it takes when the competition steps up the way that it will. And again, with a lot of these rookies, especially the free agents, not having camp is going to hurt them. But I mean, we've heard some recent news that have come out that it's possible we might be able to get some mini camps started sooner than we thought, which would be great. I mean, there were a lot of, just a couple of weeks ago, people were wondering, would we have to wait 3 months for training camp, and how long would it take before we even knew about training camp? And now there's a possibility we're going to get a mini camp next month.
Yeah, I think this would be the best news possible. And I think it opens up the opportunity for, some of these teams that are maybe behind, because they're doing virtual Zoom meetings right now for a virtual voluntary offseason program. And luckily the NFL extended that for every team because, it's hard to be able to prepare for an NFL season when you're not able to be at the facility. And I know with the NFL facilities right now, they're in phase one of reopening. They can't have more than 75 employees there as they potentially transition to phase two and beyond. As you mentioned, I mean, NFL head coaches could return next week to facilities, which could open up the possibility that not mid-July, but mid-June, end of June, you could see that early on edition of mini camps and then maybe a 2-week break and then bam, training camp will start up and the season expected to start on time. So I think that'd bode well for the world. I feel like we could really use that right now. But I
Absolutely.
think for the game and for the players itself, just getting that chemistry on the football field is going to be so critical.
Cody, great job. Can't wait till we talk again right around, well, who knows, maybe in between mini camp and training camp, because then we're going to have an opportunity to talk about the entire roster. Lots to talk about when we talk again. So thanks a lot. We'll look for you on Locked On Broncos. And how often do you do that show?
So Locked On Broncos, we do it every single day. Monday through Friday, there's a daily episode providing exclusive Denver Broncos news and coverage that you can't get anywhere else on the Locked On NFL Network.
Thanks, Cody. We'll talk to you soon.
Thank you.